with it?
Yeah.
I told Crystal.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. We're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to pass it over to Kelly and Rebecca to kick off this panel.
All right, well, thank you, Peyton. I don't know if, I guess this is on. I'm going to be talking about engaging people with lived experience to understand the scope and nature of trafficking. So a key feature of our project is that we use a community-based participatory action research approach, which included a strong researcher practitioner partnership. And it is really the focus of this presentation. So we want to introduce the partners up front. This project was led by Community Against Sexual Harm, which Terry will talk more about later, and supported by 2 research partners. There's a group of us here at RTI and also a local research partner at the Institute for Social Research at Sacramento State University. This approach to research is different than traditional approaches in that it's inclusive and it recognizes the community as experts. It also involves ongoing and meaningful participation by the community in the research project itself. So in our study that included TASH and a survivor advisory council, which we'll talk more about later. So Rebecca and I are kind of going to start providing the boring overview of the study and the high level findings. And then we're going to turn it over to Terry and April, who are going to dive into the details about how and why this project originated, the process for doing it, what survivor engagement looked like and what that meant to the community. The primary objectives of the study are pretty straightforward. We wanted to estimate the prevalence of sex trafficking in Sacramento County and also to better understand the nature of trafficking. The overall goal of this was that we would provide information back to the community that would help inform a strategic, coordinated, multi-system response to prevent and respond to sex trafficking. So why measure prevalence? Why is this important? Policymakers have actually been calling for better understanding of how common sex trafficking is for a while, and that's to help support decision-making on prevention and intervention strategies, including the resources that are actually needed to tackle the problem. If we don't know how big the problem is, how do we know what we need to invest if we have the capacity, if we don't? So understanding the prevalence has been a challenge in this field of research for a while, with some pretty profound consequences. Without empirical data on the scope of the problem, efforts to disrupt it are often then going to be influenced just by public opinion, which can either sensationalize the problem or disregard it. And so you get 2 ends of the spectrum there, where you could have too much intervention or not enough. And so anti-trafficking efforts are really stymied by this lack of data to guide any strategic approach, public health, justice, or otherwise. And because the scope and nature of trafficking may vary across place, we believe that research at the local level is a really important place to start in terms of mobilizing efforts to provide services to victims. So what do we know about the prevalence of sex trafficking in the US? Not much, actually. Prior to this, there had been 12 studies and they varied a lot across whether it was a local estimate or national, the population of focus. A lot of studies focus more on minors or even a smaller subset of minors like homeless youth or runaway youth. There's been a lot of variation in how trafficking has been measured in these studies. Some focus just on sex trafficking, others combine sex and labor trafficking to give a prevalence estimate of human trafficking overall. And because of all this variation and the only having a few studies, we can't make comparisons. So we can't say, you know, now we have a general understanding of the prevalence of sex trafficking because there just hasn't been enough research, and we don't know if the finding for one population or one community would actually be generalizable to others. So additional research on prevalence is still needed. So how is this study unique? What are we doing? This is the first study to estimate the prevalence of sex trafficking in the state of California. It's also the first sex trafficking specific study that includes adults. So as I mentioned, a lot of focus is on minors, and studies that have included adults were the ones that actually lumped sex and labor trafficking together. The goals of this project actually go beyond prevalence as well, to gain a broader understanding of the nature of exploitation and the experiences and needs of survivors. And although prior research has used a participatory approach like we do, this is the first study that's gone so far as to include survivors as interviewers in the research study, which we'll talk more about. So we used a mixed methods approach. We use multiple systems estimation to generate the prevalence estimate. It's multiple systems estimation is sometimes referred to as capture recapture, and it actually arose from work in ecology where scientists were wanting to estimate the size of like animal populations in the wild. And so if you want to know how many fish are in a pond, you don't catch and count every single fish. What they would do is catch fish, tag or mark it somehow, release it, and keep fishing. And you want to see how many times you're actually catching the same fish versus new fish, which gives you the sense of the population. And those methods have been, that concept is sort of evolved so that we can use it with administrative data, which is what we did here. We had data on individuals who had experienced sex trafficking provided to us by 9 local agencies and organizations that serve or interact with people who've experienced exploitation. So this included law enforcement, service providers, healthcare providers. And what they gave us is lists of individuals who've experienced trafficking, and we look at the overlap. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but I just wanted to mention we also did interviews with people who've experienced trafficking. And we used respondent-driven sampling, which relies on participants to recruit others. So you start with folks Cash had worked with and interviewed them, and then say, you can recruit your peers to do the survey, and then they can recruit theirs and they can recruit theirs. So you kind of get a chain that goes out. So you're trying to get a more representative sample of the population, not just the people that we've already interacted with. And the goal of those interviews was just to better understand their lived experience and to gain more contextual information that can inform our response. So I mentioned I was going to say a little bit more about multiple systems estimation. So here you can see we have these lists of individuals who've experienced trafficking that were provided to us by law enforcement and service providers. Some people are on list A, some people are on list B, some people are on both. So that's the overlap where you can look at like the capture recapture piece. And we know that there's people who are not on any of those lists. And it's a bit of an oversimplification, but if you have a lot of overlap, that people are showing up on a lot of lists, then you can say, okay, these lists actually might be pretty complete and we might have a large section of the population that's represented. If on the other hand, people are only showing up one list, there's not a lot of overlap, it suggests that the lists aren't very complete and that not captured part of the population might be rather large. So here's just a little bit of description of our sample from this administrative data. The table on the left shows the number of people who experienced trafficking who were identified by each of the agencies that provided us data. And so the number ranged, list H, we've anonymized these, of course. There was only 24 individuals. But then in list D, there was over 600. So we had agencies that had interacted with a relatively small number of individuals who experienced trafficking, and then those who had worked with more. The list on, or the table on the right is sort of this overlap piece that I was talking about. So this shows how many lists each of the people showed up on. And we see here that over 80% of our population was only on one list. And only 14% were on 2. And very, very few people were on more than that. And again, we had 9 lists total that we were looking for this overlap, which suggests that the population is probably larger than those individuals who have actually been identified. So here we see at the bottom, there's about 1,300 unique individuals who were on the data that was provided to us. But what did we find? The multiple systems estimation suggested there were about 13,000 people who had experienced sex trafficking in Sacramento County between 2015 and 2020. So this suggests that there is a huge gap in people who are identified as having experienced trafficking and those out in the community who haven't been identified at all. Here it's almost 10 times actually is what our estimate came out to be. This number comes with a whole bunch of caveats. So it doesn't mean there's 13,000 people currently being victimized. only that people were victimized at some point between 2015 and 2020. Because the length of exploitation varies, from some people could have been trafficked for a few days during that period and others for the entire 6-year period. We can't use these data to actually determine how many people were trafficked on a given day or a given year. So this number is large, but what it tells us is that it's 13,000 in this 6-year period at some point. So as I mentioned at the beginning, prevalence is important because it can help us understand the scope of the problem, which helps us then sort of what's the scope of the response need to be. But it doesn't tell us what to do. So now we have the prevalence, but it's not enough. It doesn't provide any information about the nature of the exploitation, how individuals were recruited or entered commercial sex, who they interact with, what they need to exit, what their experiences have been with law enforcement and service providers. And those are all critical issues that now we know that this problem is large. We need to answer these questions so we know what to do to inform a response that will help us prevent individuals from being trafficked in the first place, better identify individuals who are being trafficked so that we can provide services and support after the trafficking has occurred, which is why we use this mixed methods approach and also spoke with people who have been exploited. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, who's going to talk a little bit more about what we learned there beyond prevalence.
All right. So this network graph represents the interview participants. So the blue dots represent seeds. Those are people that we directly invited to participate. And then the yellow dots represent referrals. So those are people that the seed participants brought in, they recruited. So you can see that there's this cluster of seeds in the middle there that never recruited anybody. And then there are these on the outside, the sort of ring of seed participants who did bring in other referrals. And those chains ranged from 1 referral to up to 5 levels of referral, and sort of shows you, and as Kelly was describing, the purpose was to get beyond and to reach deeper into this population, to get beyond that population that maybe would walk into Cash's door and reach new people in the community, to make sure that we're really understanding the experiences, not just of those that we might have contact with already, but people that we might not have. So I think just see how we move on here. Just to give you a sense, I just wanted to note in our report, which we it is up on the RTI website, we have the same network graph with other sort of participant characteristics. So we can look at how they're connected with age, by the age at which they first entered prostitution, at their age at interview, to see if they what those relationships between these linked participants looked like. Also their market sector, that's something that we measured. These are the characteristics of the interviewees. So you can see they were all adults. To participate in these interviews, we just asked 3 screening questions. We wanted to first determine that people were adults, so we just made sure that they were at least 18 years old. We asked whether they had traded sex for money or something of value, such as a place to stay, transportation, food, or anything else. And if they answered affirmatively, we just made sure that that was within Sacramento County within the last 5 years. And then lastly, we asked if they had given some or all of the money they earned to a third party to establish the third party facilitator trafficker. These are self-reported demographics, so we did our best to collapse them into categories that are meaningful. And we tried very hard to be inclusive in our recruitment, but you can see that we have a mostly female population, and that's, I think, something that we hope to address at some point. When we were thinking about our interview domains, we're kind of telling this story backwards, because April's going to talk more about this, and Terry, but we had from the very beginning a very interactive survivor advisory group that we called the Survivor Advisory Council. that was involved in all of our study formation. So I'm going to describe the interview domains, but it's important to know that the Survivor Advisory Council was involved in helping us figure out what to include in the interview. What did we want to know about the lived experiences of these folks in Sacramento County who had been exploited? And we decided at the time to focus on these main domains. So we wanted to know about recruitment. How old were they? How did recruitment happen? What was their relationship to the trafficker? The nature of their exploitation, how long it happened, how it happened, how they were compelled to stay in those situations. We wanted to know how they were able to exit the trafficking situation, and about their interactions with law enforcement, community-based service providers. We wanted to know about the networks of traffickers and the networks among victims. And then lastly, we put this interview protocol together in 2020. So, and these interviews were conducted in 2021 and 2022. So very much during the COVID pandemic. And we wanted to know what the impact of COVID was both on a participant's experience in sex work and also the commercial sex market. We did not include any questions in our interview protocol about children, but it emerged as a really strong theme in our qualitative analysis. Over half of our interview participants ended up talking about their children without having been asked. They were just so central to the experiences of people, and their identity as a parent was very intertwined with their experiences and decision-making throughout their exploitation period. So we actually ended up working on, are you going to talk about that? We ended up working on a survivor-led brief that summarized some of these themes that we found around parenting and having children. Today, we're going to give, and that brief is available on the RTI website as well. So we'll make sure to share that link. Today, we wanted to just focus really quickly on some high-level findings related to these domains, law enforcement and barriers and facilitators to accessing services. So of all of our respondents, we found that more than half of them had had an interaction with law enforcement. And of those that had had an interaction with law enforcement, almost all of them had been arrested or cited for prostitution. A small number had been arrested or cited for something else, and then some had been stopped without actually being arrested or cited. We wanted to know what the nature of those experiences with law enforcement was, and unsurprisingly, that ranged a great deal, but the range matters. So let me share what we learned. So some of the broad themes around interactions with law enforcement were that one, some people reported that it was really helpful when law enforcement showed concern about their situation, tried to connect them with assistance or victim services. Some people did talk about how law enforcement intervention in terms of arresting their trafficker was actually a pivotal moment for their exit from the trafficking situation. And nearly half of our participants indicated that they'd been screened for trafficking if they did have interaction with law enforcement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But we also heard a lot of sort of ugly stories about law enforcement. And in particular, they sort of clustered around these three types of experiences. So being the subject of or the target of disparaging remarks, being the subject of force beyond a reasonable necessity, and then also being asked for sexual favors by law enforcement. So here's a quote that sort of sums it all up in one. One of our participants said, "So instead of asking me, am I a victim of human trafficking, I get in one of the unmarked cars and the guy was like, well, we can resolve all of this now. Basically, he wanted to trade sex for my freedom. I told him no, he got mad. I ended up going to jail. They put us all in the holding cell. And then this officer is calling them names and spits on them." That is her experience with law enforcement. And you can see that when there's this broad range of both great experiences, helpful experiences, and these negative experiences, it becomes very confusing to the community to know what to expect when they encounter law enforcement. Around screening, nearly half of those who had been cited or arrested for prostitution reported being screened for trafficking by law enforcement. And one of the problems here is that we don't know what that screening looked like. So was it, a series of screening questions that could get at the possibility that a person was experiencing exploitation, or as sort of seems to happen a little bit more commonly, sometimes law enforcement just ask, are you being trafficked? Which requires, first of all, someone to self-identify and be willing to disclose in that really upsetting moment of law enforcement intervention, which just doesn't seem to work very well. Among those who were screened for trafficking, we asked about what they said or what happened. Some said that they would lie during the screening to protect their traffickers. Some said, even if I'm screened, that doesn't prevent me from being arrested or guarantee that I'll be offered services. And when resources were offered, they were not necessarily used. So one of our participants said, I could have used help back then, but back then I wouldn't have seen it like that. And that's very common for among our interviewed population. Around community-based services, we identified 5 main barriers to accessing services. One of the themes was just a lack of awareness of the services available. I think it's important to go back to the fact that all of these interviews happened during the COVID pandemic. So even if services had normally been available, they may have been closed. So when they felt like, I don't know what services there are, even if they did know what services were available, they were not necessarily actually available at the time. People also reported feeling like they were in survival mode, or just having as a trauma response this very self-reliant approach to solving problems, and in which they're not looking for help or even thinking that help is available. Some people reported just not being in the right mindset to engage with services. Some people said it's hard to qualify for services. One person said, I don't like having to prove that I'm a victim enough to be able to qualify for services. And then also people encountered wait lists or a lack of immediate assistance available. And for this population, having the courage or having a moment where you're finally ready to ask for help and to be put on a wait list, or to have to leave a message and wait for a callback, or to go to a place and find that it's closed, is a very big barrier to ever trying to access those services again. We did find a few pathways to accessing community-based services. One of the most interesting things was that participating in this study was actually a point of access for some survivors. So part of the interview involved showing participants a list of all of the community-based services that were available in the Sacramento County area, and asking, hey, have you ever engaged with any of these? And some people actually asked if they could have that list, which the interviewers were happy to hand over. Some people noted that coming to CASH, the interviews actually took place in the CASH office. Coming in for that interview was their very first time stepping foot in a service provider's door. Some people sought services out on their own. Many times they were recommended by friends or family who had had good experiences. Notably, people were also deterred from using services if their friends or family had had bad experiences. And some people were mandated to participate in these services through the criminal legal system, or CPS. We had, again, kind of wish you went first, April, but we came up with these recommendations together. We relied so much on the Survivor Advisory Council to think about what we could say with all of this information that we were learning. And I've provided such a small amount of what we learned in this presentation. I really hope if people are interested that you'll take the time to look at our report. But we worked together to come up with some really actionable recommendations for different stakeholders in the community that were generated by our research team, including people with lived experience who were absolutely instrumental in this entire study. So, these are not rocket science. Treating people with dignity and respect makes sense. It's a good way to build rapport, obviously. Considering ways to build cases against traffickers that doesn't rely on victim cooperation or testimony is important. That's not new either. Considering that every contact that law enforcement makes with somebody involved in commercial sex is an opportunity to offer services matters. And you need to offer services once and again and again and again. And don't get frustrated if they're throwing away the brochure, because what people told us is at the right time, they're actually going to consider using those services. And then regardless of screening outcomes, services and resources should be offered. And in terms of service access, we just need to increase and vary dissemination efforts. People don't know about what services exist or how or if they qualify. And in addition to formal awareness raising campaigns, word of mouth is very powerful. And like I said before, it can be positive or negative. And we just need to reduce obstacles to service access, period. Big picture, Kelly mentioned this already, but where this study just finds there is a huge gap between the actual number of people who are affected by human trafficking, who are exploited in the Sacramento County community, and those who have been identified and served. So there's this huge need to improve victim identification and intervention and to prioritize meeting the long-term needs of survivors. So, you know, we're not doing a great job identifying people at the moment of crisis, but we're doing an even worse job, you know, helping guide people and supporting them through stabilization and sustainability in their recovery. And then we're gonna transition over to our community partners who can talk about all the more interesting stuff. If there are any burning questions about the actual like technical aspects of the study, we can take those now or just hold them for the end. All right, we'll hold them for the end.
This one.
So hi, everybody. I am Terry Galvin, and during the study, I was the executive director at Community Against Sexual Harm. And we're so fortunate that a police sergeant in SAC PD, or Sacramento Police Department, knew about RTI. And that's how we were linked to this amazing research firm when we needed them. So I am forever grateful for that. I want to tell you a little bit about us. We, as an organization, our mission is to assist women who have been commercially sexually exploited through survivor-led peer support and harm reduction services while providing education about the harm inflicted on women in the community. We've been doing this work exclusively since 2008. And when I say exclusively, if you are aware of the trafficking field, a lot of organizations have embedded anti-trafficking work in rape crisis centers or domestic violence places. So there's services embedded in many, many communities. Well, we've been one of the only organizations using this model and doing it exclusively for this amount of time. But we were incredibly small at our founding. And we were founded by a collaborative effort with our Sacramento Police Department's problem-oriented policing unit, which was a community policing group, women involved in the sex industry, because that group interacted quite frequently with people that they would arrest and take to jail and then have them right back out on the street immediately. So there was a lot of interaction, which led to questions about whether this was the most reasonable model to use to try to help people. Women that were involved in the sex industry, a business district that was very affected by commercial sex activity, and then Sacramento State professors. And so they all came together to try to determine if there was going to be a solution that would work better. And we were founded in that vein. As I said, we were incredibly small when we started. One tiny grant seeded the operation to be an outreach organization. And the vast majority of our organization's history, we were a $250,000 or less organization. And so now we're still under $1 million. So we are considered a very small nonprofit in the area. Where we found ourselves in 2019 was sitting at the point and Kelly talked about, where we had been doing this work, and then there had been some investment in the community and other anti-trafficking efforts. And through conversations, we realized that there was still no reliable way to understand the scope of sex trafficking at the local level. The studies that we did have available, there is a national hotline and they produce some data. There's no way to take that information and bring it down into Sacramento County, where our law enforcement, where the interactions are happening, where our teams are working. There was literally no way. We're serving 350 women a year. Is that 350 out of 500? Is that 350 out of thousands? It's very different. There's just no real understanding in our broader community about the gap between who's being served. There was just really no coordinated way to think this issue through, and therefore no prevention efforts. We were not doing anything that was going to prevent whatever this was. So through these discussions, and we were actually talking about diversion. Some of you might have been in the morning presentation about LEAD and diversion programs. And so we also operate a diversion program, and we were talking about expanding that. And then that's when the idea came forward that we probably needed to invest in a research project. Probably needed to know whether we were putting the right amount of money and whether we were putting it the right direction, before we just kept throwing good, not only money, effort, right? All of us in these community groups, we work hard and we work long, and eventually you have to ask, are we doing this the smartest way? And so for us, doing this told us that we would be able to have that coordinated response. We would have the data. We would be able to speak to more people more directly about what the issue was, and that our model, being survivor-led, using lived experience, would be included in this study. That was very exciting. And so we were fortunate to be sitting at a moment in 2019 when the state of California was able to do one-time local assistance funding. So this kind of idea, and then thankfully the funding was where we were sitting. And I want to say, when we talk about all this unknown, it's unknown, we didn't know. There is somebody who knows. It's the community that's impacted. They know that it was 13,000 people or somewhere darn near close, right? There's a lot of confusion, but there's a place where there's not confusion, and that is who's being impacted by these issues. And that's just really important to remember, that piece. And that certainly for me personally came up over and over again in this work and in the study in particular. But so once we knew what we were going to do, we knew it had to be a community project. It had to be a project that our community understood why we were doing it, why we were asking for this amount of money to do this type of project versus direct service, right? Everybody's in the community doing work. And we needed to have leadership buy-in, because not only did we want to do this project, we then wanted to turn into something. So we were very fortunate to have Councilmember Guerra, whose district is where we have a very active long-term prostitution stroll in Sacramento. And then Senator Pan, Dr. Senator Pan, who's very concerned that we had no prevention strategy. So we were just lucky to have leadership in our community that took us over the finish line and got the funding for the project and had the support. We knew we had to have multiple systems. The more people involved, the better the research project was going to be. And 9 was a great number of sources to have. And that took a lot of community engagement. I started talking about the project as soon as it seemed like we were going to be able to do this. I started telling people why we thought it was important, what the value was going to be to the community once we understood this, how we could start pulling in the same direction. And so we had a really good response to working with the multiple systems. And then the most important piece for us was that we knew we were going to use survivor leadership through the entire process. So we established the advisory council. And so the participatory action research, which I did not know that was the exact name when we started talking about it. I described it really well and then found it had an exact title, and that was very exciting. For me, Reason and Bradbury, they say that it's in participation with others in the pursuit of practical solutions to issues of pressing concern to people. And that comes back to what I said, that some people do know how pressing this issue is, and it's the people that are being impacted. And this type of model gives power back to the community to be in that problem-solving mode and to let them have access to what's being studied and what the results, how to create solutions for their community. It emphasizes trust, transparency, and relationship building, which many of us struggle with in our communities on various ways. So this is a model that helps bridge that. It is a trust building type of model. It's directed towards solutions and actions. Nobody has time to do things that aren't going to, on the ground level, to do things that are kind of have no impact at all. And it focuses on matters of justice, which in our communities that we work in communities where trafficking is prevalent or other complicated issues, a lot of times justice matters are an area of concern. It's inclusive and it recognizes the community as experts and it allows for deep involvement. I am very, very grateful to this team because they really wanted that deep involvement. It was not, we didn't talk about deep involvement. It was deep involvement. And April will talk a little bit more about that. But that was what we wanted out of the project and they were completely responsive. And it helps address the fact that too often communities do not see any benefit from their participation in research. You get the email, researchers come in, they say, let us study this, let us do this. Can you send us 10 people here, whatever? And we don't ever, sometimes many research projects over the years I've been there, we never even got a final copy of the report. And so, you know, that is not the best way, in my opinion, to help communities solve their problems. But there are certainly challenges to this model. So though I'm a big cheerleader for it, had to wait for this part. The first is there's no one size fits all approach. We have a replication model on the website, also exactly how we put this project together, but that won't apply to almost anybody else's community. It will still have to be adjusted. It is a model that has to be done within a community. And then there's budget constraints. This takes longer and time is money. You have to compensate people that you might not be used to putting in your budget. So you have to think about it in the beginning. There's just more, it adds a layer that definitely pays off, but it adds a layer. There's time constraints. You guys, you know, we want to work on these hours, but the people we really need to engage with, they need it to be Saturdays and evenings. And so there's a mismatch and you have to navigate that because that's just the work. And this I cannot state enough, data sharing is very difficult in communities. And every single person that you need data from is going to have their own system of what a data sharing agreement is going to require. And I think we knew it was going to take some time, and it was during COVID. But whew, that part took a long time. We got everybody that we wanted and it all worked out, but it's a challenge. It certainly, if you're not prepared for that challenge of data sharing. We had to take time, and this is how we use that time, to build trust amongst each other. We had to trust each other. We had to trust each other. We had a whole other on the ground research team that had to trust all of us. And then all of our partners who were sharing their data, they had to trust us. That's a lot of communicating and a lot of being present with people and a lot of making sure that we're all talking together to pull off a project like this. And then when we provided feedback, or anybody provided feedback, we had to share our power. When we brought things back to the RTI team to change, they changed them. They heard what we said. There was never, and no point were we told we couldn't do what we wanted to do or what the council said, not one time. So I think that the being able and interested in sharing power is a fundamental part of this. And then the other thing is that trauma impacts communities and individuals in unique ways. And I think that's really important to recognize that when we're studying these complex issues, we have community level trauma. And so we're in that space trying to do research. And so that just is something that we should not get away from. We should have an understanding. So with our process, we started by being that trusted organization, that small organization on the ground. And almost every community has somebody like us, a survivor-led or a small organization that's on the ground doing that work. We just normally don't also get to participate in something this big. We put the survivor leaders in our initial budget. We assembled the advisory council that April will talk more about, with the intention that we were going to use their expertise, not that we were going to assemble them and have them, you know, just be together, that they were going to fundamentally drive this project. We had a therapist on site. It's vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, all of the trauma that we just talked about being in a community like this, you have to be prepared to address it. And it did come up. It came up for all of us throughout the project. It came up for the interviewers. And so we had to be in front of that. And then obviously staff members were always available to continue supporting people. We did not have a male survivor. We are a woman serving organization. So we did contract with a male survivor to make sure that we had that piece. From the research team, RTI has specialists in participatory action research. So she was on our team and she guided the process. And then our on the ground Institute for Social Research, they have social workers. They were in the project. So we were really intentional about making sure the project was surrounded by people who understood this type of work. And this is our dashboard, excuse me. And it went up really early. I think we had it up fairly early in the project, and that was really meaningful to us. And that might be something that's common or typical, but for us to have something where it's like, this is what we're doing. And we said we were going to write that transparency piece in the beginning, why participatory action research matters is because it's transparent. We started that way and everything has been put up here from that time forward. Everything we've done is posted on here. And that was really meaningful to us as an organization and as a community. And then through all of this planning and all of our conversations, unexpected things absolutely came up. Once that respondent-driven sampling process worked and we were having people come to be interviewed that we had no relationship with at all, and we were paying cash stipends, it became apparent that my practice of letting everybody go home for the day and staying and working late and then leaving on my own was probably not wise. And my team and everybody else said, you probably have to start leaving with the rest of the staff because now we're kind of known in the community as having cash on hand, which is different and nothing I ever thought about, but that probably wasn't wise. So I had to adjust that. So there's little things that will come up because you're not usually in the space and you can't think of everything. So we altered and we kept going. I'm going to now turn it over to April. She's on our Survivor Advisory Council, and she'll give you a little bit more perspective of actually doing the work from that part.
Good afternoon. I'm April Grayson. I'm the Policy Director of the Sister Warrior Freedom Coalition, and I'm also a member of the Survivor Advisory Council. So from June 2020 to June 22nd, we met monthly. We still meet monthly. We were going to meet on Saturday. I got to fly back for that. We meet monthly. We assisted with developing the overall research direction. We, from the beginning, who, the whats, the wheres, the whys, the hows, the what ifs, how do we not miss this person? How do we make sure that everybody is seen and heard? We sat in think tanks and we thought through all of that so that everybody would be seen. We provided direction on connecting with the community because as we saw with the different bubbles, everybody's reach is different. The population that I'm gonna reach versus the population that another council member is gonna reach is different. So how do we make sure that everybody is brought in, how everybody is connected? What do we need to, how do we change our language? How are we approaching people? How do we not alienate people because we're out here with the under a tent? We were gonna be under a tent one time. We're like, no. Like, how do we make, like we were thinking about passing out cards and then that was a barrier. Like, how do we make sure that we do not create any unnecessary barriers to bring people in? We set the standard on how we would treat each interview participant. I mean, we think we live in a world that is fueled by kindness and decency and equality. But when you work with survivors, you realize that really is not true. And we are a population that is often treated horribly because of our lived experience. So we set the standard that everybody would come in. It didn't matter what they looked like, how they showed up, if they were hungry, if they only were coming for the money, none of that mattered. They were all gonna be seen and treated with respect, kindness, and dignity. And when they did leave cash, hopefully they would come back to cash because they knew when you got to cash, there were people there that cared about you. I'm a little nervous and emotional because I love cash. We assisted with the recruiting initial seeds for projects. So we sat and everybody was like, okay, who are our people? Who are we gonna send out to go get our people? And so we all had our seed members. We went out and hey you, hey you, hey you. Let me tell you about this program. Let me tell you about cash. Let me tell you about this. And then from there it grew. We actually conducted the interviews. We were trained so that we were able to conduct effective interviews. And we had an on-site debrief and a therapist available because this is heavy work. I think everybody was touched by how heavy this work was. We discussed the findings and emerging themes because everything is always changing. And there's no one size fits all to who a survivor is or what a survivor looks like. Like my story in the council is very unique to everybody else's story. And so if we put one person, then we don't come up with the 13,000. So we were constantly discussing the findings and what could possibly come out of this. We created 2 videos with survivors to assist with informed consent documents. This was very funny for us because when we saw how long that consent form was, that's boring. We're gonna lose people and no. And then having it like, who wants to lose a person before you ask them the most horrific stuff in their life? So we created videos so that everybody was able to just participate. Let's participate together, which was great for us. And then council ideas were always implemented because even the idea of the video came out of us saying, no, this is not going to work for our people. So the Survivor Advisory Council results and recommendations. We helped to create 8 recommendations. We learned about current prevention and identification methods. And so we were able to, be current in what's going on today, because what happened 20 years ago, what happened, although we still have the problems from 20 years ago, we still have to be more, how are we combating today's situation and people? We participated in a press conference releasing the research findings to our community. It's really exciting. I had us in the front row. I think I'm funny, y'all, so please. We selected the topic and created a women and children's action brief with RTI. So the thing about that is like everything was very democratic because I wouldn't have selected an action brief for women and children because I don't have any children. But we put up all of our topics, everybody put their vote on, and we kept going and going and going until we all came to the consensus of what we were actually gonna have this action brief about. That's what I loved. It was a very democratic system because I'm very loud and I did not win. So everybody's voice was at the table. We assisted with sharing the results and completion of the prevalence estimates to their networks. Oh, did I skip? No. Okay. Wait. Oh, there I am. So my background and my perspective. This photo right here that I took was, I am now the policy director of my organization. I was actually testifying for one of the first bills that I had actually written the language from, thought of the concept, and it was a bill that would actually see me as a survivor of trafficking and allow me to have a vacatur in California so that my record would be sealed. And I just came from testifying and I was in shambles and I ran to Terry because I was like, oh God, this is so difficult. Policy is difficult, especially when it's close to your heart and you're fighting for a population that people cannot see behind these walls in these prisons and people that you drive by and you walk by daily. So my background is I am a criminalized survivor. I spent from age 19 to 37 housed in California, well, the United States world's largest women's prison. Never seen as a survivor of trafficking, never identified as a survivor of trafficking, saw as the perpetrator and sent away to go spend my youth, my adulthood to 37 years old in prison. Never identified as a survivor until I got to Cash and Terry was like, I think we need to talk about some things. I went to go be a volunteer and Terry was like, no, you need to come into our program and get some resources. So that was in 2015 when I actually came into Cash. So here we are in 2020. I have gone on to go do amazing things for the work for the community. I have a national platform and Terry was like, no, come on in and join this council, which was a little difficult for me because I'm very busy. But when Terry asks for stuff, you go because it's meaningful. Like Terry's not doing it based off of what for Terry's ego. It's like, what does the community need? And your voice needs to be heard. And a lot of times we're not told that our voice needs to be heard. So we don't show up for stuff. So, but we joined the council because Terry said, come on. And so then there's the research process. And we're sitting in this room with 10 different perspectives, 10 different experiences. And we had to go through everything to get to this point. of our experiences, what were our barriers, who are the people that are not being served, how are we going to outreach to people, how are we going to collect the information, how are we going to make sure that we're not harming people in the process of this. And we just started brainstorming and then did the work. And so I would remember pulling up to Cash and there was interviews and people walking in, and the thought and the intention and the consideration was there as we were doing this research. We created our recommendations and our action briefs, which, like I said, is very democratic situation. We were all sitting there adding to this project from our lenses, though, and what we needed, or what could have helped me not go to prison. How could somebody have identified me and I would have been able to have resources in the community? What the project means personally. Like, even to this day, I still haven't been able to wrap my own mind around the project because it's so large and it's like a milestone. But to be able to give people who are experts in this field your work and say, hey, this is what I've worked on. This is what we have worked on. And then to be able to even show the other advisory council members to people and give them access to the platform that I have based off of this project. Working with a team of survivors, we're all funny. We have a very dark sense of humor. We love each other. And the thing that brought us all together was Cash, and the fact that Cash had been so intentional in how they had interacted with us from the day that we were clients to now survivors on this board. And when you work with survivors, a lot of times we're othered, we're dismissed, we're not seen as experts. If I wouldn't have told you that I was a survivor of sex trafficking, you would see me as the policy director of an organization that is holding right now a constitutional amendment in California to end slavery. And that's who I am. So when you involve survivors, you have to involve them at every level. Like Terry didn't say, April, you can't participate because you're doing all these amazing things. Terry said, no, you need to be here. And then Terry didn't say that this person couldn't participate because they weren't on the level that I was on. Because when we're all in this room, it doesn't matter who I am or who they are, we're all survivors. And we all are trying to reach a population that people are having a difficult time reaching. So include your survivors, let them lead stuff. They know what they're talking about. They might not say it as eloquent as you. They might not use the words that you use, but they know what they need. They know what they didn't get, and they know what the people that you cannot see need. And they're gonna help you get to those people because they're hiding from us. Like, they're scared of us because we have harmed them. Not me, but other folks. I'm done? Oh, okay. Okay, so in the process of us, like, we have the dates of 2020 to 2022. We are now in 2023. And like I said, I will be on Saturday meeting with folks to tell them about y'all and this amazing conference and presentation. So we were funded for an additional year. But in that funding, like, we had to keep on moving, and our stipends grew. We would just every step of the way, the intention was there not only for us, but for the people we were researching, for our community. Like, I missed this part. We had to talk to the community about an issue that was going on in front of their faces that they did not know was happening. Stockton Boulevard in Sacramento, California is a highly trafficked area. Cars are up and down the street. It's in a community that is the lowest income community in Sacramento, and the women are being trafficked every day in front of the police, in front of the community, and nobody is aware that this is happening. I should have said that a few minutes ago, but y'all, I just think it's important because, like, one of the survivors had told Terry, like, how does nobody know this? And they drive past us every day. Me personally, I drive by Stockton Boulevard every chance I get because I want to see who's out there so I can be like, who can we serve? Who can we help? What's going on? Oh, the Blade isn't that crowded today. Blade is a stroll. Today it's quiet, or it's raining. There was a bunch of girls out there. The police presence is out there. The community needed to know what's going on in their community of these people that they walk by daily, or why their street is so crowded. Like, why is the street crowded? Why is their lights dark? Like, why are you needing stuff in your community? Like, this is what's going on. So, your turn.
You can imagine how great our Saturday meetings are. I mean, it just is been the highlight of my career to have been on this project and have done it this way. I mean that out of everything I've done, this has been the most meaningful. So we are continuing. So the next thing we worked on was a law enforcement advisory brief, and that is also online. That was the next topic that we wanted to take on, to give helpful suggestions to really put everybody's voice into that brief. We are now trying to come up with the ways that we will do an action-focused awareness campaign that talks about our research findings, how we can kind of go past your general awareness, and we can go into our community now really well armed and say, how are we going to take action? Like, our message is going to be action oriented. And we're meeting with policymakers and stakeholders and the general public, this public who has not been well clued into this issue. We're figuring out how to meet and talk, and now we have data and we have this strong package, so we can talk to people on all levels. We can talk to people in all ways to say that this is the problem and we know what it is. We need everybody's help, because now, remember, small organization, it's not, we did all of this and we found all these people and now cash will take care of it. This is a community effort now, and that's where we started. This is for everybody to tackle, because this is an issue that is in all communities and really causing a great deal of lasting harm. So more time. And that's the practical solutions that go back to the original model, right? And what Bradbury and Reason said was that this model, participatory action research, is to come up with practical solutions. That's the charge when you take this on. And so we are expanding our council. We have a couple new members who have applied. That's very exciting to see now the council evolve. We want the council to be a community resource. We're telling our community, you know, we have this active council and they know a lot and they're educated on things like identification and, you know, all of the different prevention things that are going on. Use us, we're here. We want to implement our recommendations. We don't want a list of recommendations on a piece of paper. We want them implemented. And then we want to model this model. Use people in your community to solve your complex social problems. Period. Like that's what, that is what we want to see happen. And then we want to be a resource for anybody's considering this model. You can come and Zoom into our council, ask your questions. We want to be a resource. We want to see this model used much more widely in all different sorts of ways. And we want to be a resource for that. So that's one of our next steps.
If y'all zoom in, be prepared to laugh.
Yes, you will get some jokes out of it also. And that's what we have for you today.
Are there any questions from the audience? Anybody?
What are your priorities to tackle in this next year with the council?
Our priorities to tackle, can you hear me if I just talk loud? So our priorities are to expand the council, have the council expand themselves. So for them to work through that model of being kind of a self-sustaining advisory council. It is to do that action-based awareness to move. We had another study done from ISR, the Institute for Social Research, that found that about 20% of the same Sacramento County region knew anything at all about what we were doing about sex trafficking. So we just have gaps everywhere. So we're working on that as one of the strategies. And then we're doing another action brief, and we're going to do that on peer support and on participatory work to have that for the community.
Awesome. Any other questions? Oh, no, I just gave Abby that so she could take it to people in the back.
How is participatory action research different than just snowballing recruitment technique?
So the respondent-driven sampling is a little different from snowball sampling because first there's a limit on the number of people that you can refer. So every person who participated could refer up to 3 people. So we didn't want the same person bringing in like only people from their networks or network because then it would potentially be kind of skewed. We were really looking for a range in market sectors. So we asked people, you know, whether they worked online or on the street or in truck stops and trying to get a range of different experiences represented. And it's compensated too. So when a person brought in someone else who participated in an interview, they were also paid for, the referrer was paid and then the new person was paid quite well.
And then the difference between participatory action research and that? You can answer that one.
Well, that wasn't really the participatory part of this interviewing. The participatory elements were that they were being interviewed by the members of the Survivor Advisory Council. And the whole interview protocol was developed by the Survivor Advisory Council and the rest of the research team. So the whole process was participatory.
I have a question. Do you guys feel that the interviews that came back to you were different because we used survivors versus using a traditional research structure?
Yes. And we drew upon RTI's existing resources about, we put together a training about how to do interviews. So we used RTI developed resources to structure this package to help train the interviewers. And it was so wrong. It was like all wrong. We looked at it and we were like, this does not work at all. It was terrible. So that's one thing. We realized like the assumptions we used to have or maybe still have about how interviews should be done are wrong and terrible. So that needed to be updated. And then once we had better protocols in place that were appropriate and decent, we found that what they were all learning was very honest because there was this, and there are other people in here who looked at some of the interview data. Amanda helped code some of those, and there's this sense of understanding and rapport, and sometimes we didn't even understand it. Like we had to ask each other, like, what do you think this even means? But that's great because that means you were really connecting with each other.
Wait, what was wrong? Can you give a couple examples of how the existing procedures were wrong?
So if you really want to know, something that sticks out to me
I'm asking, I want to know.
is, so there's like these assumptions about how the people you're interviewing are different from you, inherent in the protocol, at least the one we looked at. So it was like, you need to remember to like dress this way because, people that you're interviewing may this, and like make sure that it was kind of like instructive about, there were a lot of assumptions about both the interviewer and the interviewee that assumed like a lot of difference. And that does not work for these peer-led conversations, and kind of pointed out to us like this, why are these assumptions ever valid, right? I mean, maybe there's a time and place for it, but I think assuming there's such a big difference between the interviewing person and the interviewee is kind of problematic.
And dealing with a population like that, had we had done the interviews based off of that, people wouldn't have come back. We wouldn't have been able to have people, they would have talked to us. So it had to be led from us by our heart to our people, because that was a barrier. It was a barrier to assume that I knew this, or to assume that this person knew that. When our people were hungry, they didn't want to know these questions, and they didn't want to know that black and white stuff that you guys process, because they were not going to talk to us.
That was what I was going to say, that the questions and how to set up the protocol. The very first thing on the Survivor Advisory Council was, we're going to have food for everybody, right? They're going to come hungry. They're going to be without their basic needs. How are they going to be able to do this and this and this long before you talk to them about any of this? That was their concern right from the beginning.
And most research, like had Terry had said, people come into your community, they come dressed in these suits, they look so different from you. There's a separation, there's this thing like this hierarchical that's strange. And how do you relate to people when you've already placed yourself above them? Who's going to tell you anything? And we were asking people to tell us their deepest, darkest stuff that they probably had never told anybody in the world. So how are they going to trust me knowing they might not have showered for 3 days? They possibly were hungry. Their trafficker could have been outside for all we know. We did not know these things. So why create a barrier that was gonna cause a person to never walk through our door? One, to do the interview, and two, we were now we had created where they wouldn't come back to now receive services. The research report was never, ever more important than a person and making sure that they were able to get the services they needed.
That's exactly it. So if you look at our protocols about like, there's instruction about like how to address and it just does not make sense for this in particular.
I just, another quick question. Did you find a lot of your victims and survivors were local to Sacramento, or were they moving throughout the state? And how did that impact your estimation process?
To participate in the interviews, they had to have experienced trafficking in Sacramento County within the last 5 years. And you probably have a better sense of the.
We asked questions about, so they had to have been trafficked during that time so that we could, that was our Sacramento County number. But one of our questions was if they also were trafficked in other places, if they moved around. And I would say there was a vast majority of them that at least stayed on our typical circuit. So they were, you have the places where people typically move around to. And so that was very common. A little less common, people who were going state to state to state, but that was definitely there also. So we kind of found everything.
We have a chapter in our report about movement, if you want to read it.
We had a question online. Thanks for your presentation. What an amazing application of community-based participatory research. Can you speak more about the process of building and maintaining trust among the partners and what that process will look like as you expand?
I'm taking that to mean the partners, like the people who shared their data with us in the broader community partnership. So that took a lot, it took time. It took making sure that prior to while we were doing the data sharing agreements, that we were in contact, that we were keeping them updated. After we collected the data, still letting them know where we were with the project. I sat on a lot of community boards or different community things where I was always giving an overview of where we were in the project. And so it just was really having the understanding that this was a community project. We could have done other things with the money and we chose to do this. So I felt very responsible to the community throughout the entire project. And now for sustaining it, we really want everybody to understand the research, understand our recommendations and how we can all help pull in that same direction, and how to keep using either our advisory council for anti-trafficking efforts, or to look at the other very complicated problems we have in Sacramento County and want to replicate. So that's how we want to be able to continue to be a resource.
All right, and one follow-up question, this is from me, not online. What changes have you seen or would you like to see from law enforcement in Sacramento County, police department or sheriff's department?
So we're really fortunate that because we were founded in partnership with SACPD, that we've always had a really good relationship. So they were very excited to have the research project completed. They are excited to hear even the parts that are not flattering, because they do a lot of training. It gave them more information to be able to do better training. They have our briefer now where they can use that. And then with all of our law enforcement partners, they understand our recommendations. We're still in community with them and we're working through all of those things. Our law enforcement partnership was really important, has always been important. And this issue requires that relationship to just continue to be deepened. So, and I really do think giving them what is in the form of the data, and then having access to all of the work that we do in the council just makes the entire community effort more responsive to what's needed. And safer, April said, and safer.
April, you mentioned the democratic process for picking the action brief topic. What were some of the other options or like top choices that y'all had?
I'll just speak to one. Like for me, I always want to focus on law enforcement and how it affects my population because that's the population that I fall under. And so that was one of our choices that did not make the brief. And it might not even, we might not even make a brief about it because who knows, something else might arise that we might decide is not more important, but something that will reach a larger population of folks. But the criminal justice system was something that I wanted to do.
Yeah, the one that we did was specific to law enforcement officers' interaction, the interaction findings. And April is always wanting to look at the bigger picture, criminal justice, which is maybe something that we will be able to look at through that lens. Or not being able to do what everybody wants at the moment has not taken away from their participation, which I think is really important to note, that you don't have to feel like, well, we have to do everything everybody wants. It's really building that trust. And like April said, what's going to reach the most people right now? And so we're all on board to push in that same direction, knowing that in the best case, we're working together for a long time and we get to all of these things.
And another thing that came out of that is now the advisory council cares about policies. And they're like, well, how do we get on the prevention side of this? How do we make sure that people understand that these policies they're writing don't help us? And now they just want to participate. So I did not get what I wanted, but I did though, because now I have an advisory council that cares about what I care about.
Any other questions? Anybody? Okay, cool. Well, thank you guys so much. I'm not sure what time it is, but we will go ahead and break early. Yeah, cool. And we will come back at 3 for our final presentation. Thank you guys so much.